recorded. The first thing to say, it's about reading. The talk's about reading. And the first thing to say, and I never get tired of saying this, is reading is a truly incredible, amazing human achievement. Through reading and writing, we can communicate with loved ones when we're hundreds, thousands of miles apart. We can witness history as it was being made by reading eyewitness accounts. We can be transported to magical worlds that make us reflect on our own reality and see it in different ways. And of course, once we can read, we've got almost infinite possibilities for learning. So, reading, that ability to communicate across space and across time is an incredible human achievement. One or two other little things about reading. Across school age groups, girls report that they read more than boys, and not surprisingly, given that, girls also outperform boys in reading. Across age groups, across cultures, girls read better than boys, it would seem. But what I want to focus on today is reading in the second language classroom, and particularly about how we use questions to do with reading. Because I think a fairly standard approach to how we deal with reading has emerged in English language teaching. So what I'm going to do is show you a sort of brief sort of outline of of what I think is a typical reading lesson. And I would just like you to look at it and see if you kind of recognize it. Does that look familiar? I'm sort of pleased one or two people are saying yes, because otherwise we may as well finish the talk now, I mean, we're done, frankly. It's nothing like what we do. We build interest in the topic. We want to motivate learners to read. This is a very sensible thing to do. And while we're doing that, we may be able to feed in bits of background knowledge. And that's important because we know from research that background knowledge correlates to comprehension, so it's a very good thing to do. We pre-teach vocabulary, well, maybe not always, but it's a way of adjusting the level of the text and making difficult texts a bit more accessible. So they're the sort of before reading bits of a reading lesson. And at the end, I think it's quite common after reading that we have a discussion or something like that. But the bit I want to focus on today is the bit in the middle, the while reading activities, which for developing reading skills is clearly the most important bit. I think it's pretty common practice to have at least 2 readings of the text, one probably quite quickly. Even for texts that maybe don't lend themselves to being read very quickly, we still quite often ask learners to do it. And the purpose of that, I guess, is to make the second, more intensive reading a bit more accessible, a bit easier. And I want to look at that sort of second reading task. And the things I think are pretty common are those kinds of activities. Again, you may want to just have a quick scan through them and see if you recognize them. There's a reading text, and then we get students to answer multiple choice questions, or true-false questions, or those who, what, where, when questions, where the answer is clearly retrievable from the text. There's a clear factual sort of answer to it. And then the other things as we go through are maybe a bit less common. So, as you may have gathered from those of you with good inferencing skills may have worked out that the answer to my question, do we need so many questions, in my opinion is probably no, all right? I'm sure your reading skills were up to reading that in the title. But before we get to that, I want to say, well, what are the arguments for doing this? Well, what arguments are put forward to support the practice? Well, I should say these aren't actual quotes from individual teachers. These are sort of composite views that I've heard a lot of justification for. It's the only way we know that our learners have understood. Well, it's a way. Asking those sort of true, false, multiple choice type questions is a way of checking understanding, but it's not the only way. And as someone pointed out this morning on Twitter in a sort of preview chat to this talk, said, well, actually, you may be able to answer them without understanding any of it, just by understanding sentence structure. You can guess the answer quite often. It gives students confidence when they get the questions right. This is an interesting bit of... I wrote a paper on reading not long ago, and one of the bits of feedback we got from a reviewer was, you've been a bit tough on use of comprehension questions. We quite like comprehension questions because it gives students confidence when they get them right. I think that's true. If you accept that as being true, you've probably got to accept as well that they completely destroy students' confidence when they get them wrong. You can't logically argue, well, it gives confidence when you get it right, but has zero impact when you get it wrong. Clearly there will be an impact there. Well-designed questions direct learners to the most important parts of the text. Yeah, absolutely. And a crucial reason for using comprehension questions, those typical comprehension questions, is to achieve that point, I think. That you good questions direct learners to the key parts of the text, where the narrative pivots, the key arguments, really important purpose of questions. It's what we do, that's the expectation, yes. Now, a lot of teachers say to me, well, we do it because the students expect it. But we're going to come back and talk about expectation a little bit in a moment. And the last sort of quite common response I get is, well, it's easy to set as homework. Well, fair enough, and I think reading is a great thing to do for homework. The more learners read, the better. The research evidence for that is quite strong. But maybe we can't just set it for homework. We want things to do in the classroom. We need to show learners that we value reading by doing it in the classroom as well. So those are the arguments for. The arguments against using non-stop sort of testing devices are these, I think. The arguments against, well, those things I showed you, the multiple choice questions, the true-false questions, they don't really teach anybody anything. They are just testing devices. They test comprehension. They test the learner's ability to focus on a little bit of a product of a text, a fact which they extract from the text. If learners are getting it wrong, there's not much about helping them read better, the process of reading, which is really important. Those sort of multiple choice questions, true-false questions, they lack authenticity. I think we'd have to agree. I was coming up here on the train yesterday, and I was reading a newspaper story on my phone. And, when I got to the end of the story, there weren't 5 multiple choice questions that popped up, where the sort of, well, you have to get 4 out of 5 right, or you're not allowed to access the next text. It's not what we do with reading texts, to be honest, just answer questions about them. And there's a lack of affective engagement, and this is something that came up in Paul's talks this morning, that there's a cognitive challenge to answering those questions, which is good, but learners don't get to express much about their feelings about the text, which bits of the text they found funny or interesting or depressing. They don't get to express that very much. And as we said, answering those questions, they're testing devices, they can be quite anxiety-provoking. Great, if you're the student who got 6 out of 6, fantastic. If you're the student who got 2 out of 6, you just feel bad about yourself. They may have quite a negative impact in that way. They quite often focus on details in the text, those sorts of questions, because you end up having to write questions about the things that you can get a single correct answer for, rather than the overall meaning. And as I say, they don't do much for the process of reading. So I wouldn't say teachers should never use true-false questions or multiple choice questions. I think they should, but I don't think it's the only thing we should be doing. But it's not enough for me to say what I don't like. I think, in the UK, we found out in the last couple of years that just saying what you don't want isn't very good. You actually need to be able to say what you do want sometimes. So, some obvious alternatives. Well, we could use better questions. I'm not saying all questions are bad, by the way, but we could vet them and look for the ones that are good. And what would make good questions? Well, we would check that they did focus on the most important parts of the text. And those questions have a single sort of factual answer. In Schachter's work, they're characterized as being shallow questions. You don't need to understand that much about the text to be able to pick out that detail and answer the question. We could turn them into deep questions. And for Schachter, deep questions are ones where you've got to make inferences from the text, or where you've got to take bits of information from different parts of the text to arrive at your answer. And for teachers, it's quite easy to create deeper questions that require more processing just by turning them into why questions. Why is this important? Why did the writer even bother putting this detail in the text? What purpose does it have in the text? So we could probably use better questions. Let me just have a sip of water, and I'll move the microphone away because it's not going to be fun for you listening to the water. Okay, summarizing. I think summarizing is really underused, actually. And it doesn't have to be particularly difficult or arduous. You can do a 2 or 3 bullet point summary. It could be done in L1. And we know from research in L1 settings that practicing summarizing boosts comprehension. It's a way of developing comprehension. Now, I'm not aware of research that's been done in summarizing in L2 classrooms. And Paul mentioned this morning that you may be able to do the summary in the learner's L1. Well, I'm not aware of the research evidence. So if anyone is aware of it, please email me and let me know the research evidence, because I'm not aware that much research has been done on it. And the other thing we could look at is retelling stories more, narratives more. Again, if you think about that authenticity issue and me on the train yesterday with the newspaper story, while it's not very realistic for me to sort of answer 5 multiple choice questions after it, there is a good chance that I might say to someone, oh, you know what, I read something really interesting in the paper the other day, and relate the story to them, very briefly. So we could do those kinds of things. And what I want to do now is share 3 quite specific activities. So these are 3 quite general activities, and I'll share 3 quite specific activities with you. And the first one is this. So what I do with my learners is give them these sentence stems, and they all start this sentence, something. Now, I've put sentence, and that was for a reason. It fitted on the slide quite well. In reality, I say this sentence / section of text, but that just looked really ugly on the slide when I wrote that much, all right? So this sentence or section of text. And if you look at the one sort of second down on the left, this section of text summarizes, and then what the learners have to do, they go through the text. They may have already done that sort of multiple choice type, true, false type thing with the text. Then they go through it and say, well, this section of the text summarizes, and they have to then find a bit of text which summarizes and say what it summarizes. And what I like about this activity is you can focus learners on the discourse structure of the text. So you've got this sentence introduces, this sentence summarizes, this sentence links to, and the research evidence is that learners who understand the discourse structure of texts, again, understand more from the text. So it's not just there for something to do, it actually boosts comprehension. And it's a very simple activity to do. All the teachers I work with around the world, one of the joys of my job is I get to work with teachers from all over the world, but they all just about uniformly sort of characterize themselves as being overworked and underpaid. So, you know, it's a very simple activity to do, to use. And you can also build an affective engagement with the text through it. This sentence reminds me of, this sentence is funny because, or whatever you want to do. You don't have to just use these stems, of course. And the top one on the right, this sentence is important because, again, that's a way of directing learners to pick out for themselves the most important parts of the text. You could have another stem that says, this sentence is not very important because. Okay, so you can use those sentence stems in quite a number of ways. Sorry, that's just the mechanics of how to do the exercise, right? I asked my learners to draw this table in their notebook. It's often used as a pre-reading activity, but I'm going to talk about it as a while reading activity. And on the left, the learners go through and they pick out those little products of information that you get, what they've understood from the text. But in the middle column, the one that colour looks a bit odd in here. Sorry, not a very nice choice of colour perhaps. But anyway, in the middle column, they write down things that they think are implied in the text, but maybe they're not too sure of. Is it a legitimate inference to draw from the text? We often say that students should infer things from text. That's a good reading skill, and it is a good reading skill, a high-level reading skill, but do we ever really support them much in doing it? So here they say, well, this is what I think the author's saying, but am I right in deducing that? And why I like that middle column is that it does allow us to work then on the process of reading a little bit, rather than just did they get the facts right in the left-hand column. That's important, we're going to check that, but also the things they're not sure of, and we can actually help learners develop more as readers. Okay, and one last thing to, how can I explain this? Right, you know that plan I gave you at the start where we said build interest, pre-teach vocabulary, set tasks, that sort of thing, right? Those activities work by teachers or coursebook writers, materials writers, selecting a text which they believe will be interesting to the learners, and then looking at, well, what information can be extracted from that text, okay? That's the pattern. We select an interesting text, what can be extracted from it. But outside the classroom, we don't always read because we want to, we often read because we have to, okay? So let me just give you an example. A few weeks ago I was asked, would I go to Turkey to do a talk? And I said, yes, I'd be delighted to, I'd love to. And as soon as I said yes, I thought, do I need a visa for Turkey? The answer is yes, by the way. If any of you are going to Turkey, you do need a visa for Turkey. But, you know, that's not fun reading, believe me. But what you do is you put it into Google and you come up with lots of results, and you have to select the most reliable one. And then you select the text and you find the information you want. In other words, you go from having a goal, information you need, to finding the text that might realistically give you that information and reading for that purpose, okay? Which is the other way round to how it usually works in classrooms. So let me just give you an example of what I mean. Okay, so here's an example that I sometimes use. I've put English-speaking environment because that pushes the learners to only access websites that are in English, typically. So they have to find a potential course. And then I know there's a certain irony here, because I've said, do we need questions? Then what I do is ask them questions, so I'm sorry. I ask them those kinds of questions about the text. So they have to find the text, so I try and find a realistic situation. What might they need information for? Now, your learners may not be interested in higher education and English-speaking environment. That's fine, but you can probably think of all sorts of things they might want information about, which they could access from different places. So they set themselves goals, reasons for reading, and then try and find the answers to them. Okay. I just want to talk very briefly about some research, and I should say right from the outset, this is not my research. This is the research of one of my PhD students, Alessandra. I don't know, she may be watching it, and she'll probably be hitting her head saying, no, that's not what you should have said. I apologize to her if that's going to be the case. So some research. Alessandra wrote some material for the Brazilian government, and her PhD is about evaluating that material. And when we looked at the material, the material is online material, but it looks and feels a bit like a course book in many ways. It has most of the features you would find common in course books. So it has a bit of grammar, a bit of vocabulary, some text and so on. And we were looking at things that we could evaluate, that we thought would be interesting to evaluate. And the thing that struck me were the reading texts, partly because the reading texts came at the end of the unit, which I thought, I don't know, do they come at the end of the unit in most course books? Maybe not, I don't know, I don't think so. And the reading texts have a little icon on them, which you can click on and you can get a recording of somebody reading the text. And they have a little glossary. And that is it. They have a title, and they have the text. very different to my experience of English language teaching material in course books. And so what we did, and I have to say, when I saw this material, I was expecting it to be quite negatively evaluated for that expectation argument, you know, that sort of argument of, you know what, yeah, we want questions, we expect questions, where are our questions? But that was, a couple of students did say that. A couple of students did respond they would have liked questions, but the majority, a big majority, didn't. And the sort of responses we got from other students were these. A pause after work, a relaxing moment. Where the student who said that, the user of the material who said that, I don't think she meant sort of work as in, I don't know, she worked in a bank or something. She meant the work of going through the rest of the unit, you know, studying the grammar, studying the vocabulary and that sort of thing. And then if you look at the bottom one, it didn't feel like I was studying English. It seemed something for entertainment, but at the same time, learning. And I was trying to think, how do we explain this? And the sort of theoretical model that I think probably explains why the learners actually responded quite positively to it is those sort of arguments that are put forward for extensive reading. It should be pleasurable. It should be easy. It should not be anxiety-provoking, and did I get all the answers right? Okay, and I think that explains why the students actually quite liked it. On the issue of extensive reading, if you want things to read about reading, there is a thing in the Cambridge White Paper series, the Cambridge White Paper series on extensive reading in ELT, why and how. So if you're interested, you can get that. That's absolutely free. There's another one, extensive reading for primary in ELT. I was just on a bit of a roll with extensive reading, so extensive reading in primary in ELT. Again, absolutely free. There's another one that I'm afraid is not free, but is on the Cambridge stand if you want to look at it. Those are the references from what I've said. And that's it, unless you've got comments or suggestions. If you do have questions or comments, forgive me, I'm going to have to repeat them, because the people watching on the live stream are not going to be able to hear your question, so I will just repeat it. And the other thing to mention is my hearing is sometimes not all that good, so please don't be scared, shout at me, all right? Because otherwise I'm going to not get it.
I have a question. I teach exam preparation, and in that context, those questions you listed at the beginning are authentic. Do you think these ideas are appropriate for my context?
Yes. No, I did. Sorry, the question was, if you're teaching exam classes, and exam classes will be tested on, you know, multiple choice type questions and different particular exam tasks, would you do other things? And my answer would be, yes, you would do both. I think you definitely need the exam practice. Typically in an exam course, I assume most of us go from trying to teach and develop skills and a bit of exam practice at the beginning to, by the end, more or less all exam practice. But we do still need to develop skills, and things like summary writing, summary building seems to actually make people better readers. So my answer would be, yeah, probably a bit of both. But it's up to in the end, teachers know their classes' needs and what they need. Certainly, it's a good point. If people are learning English in order to pass an exam, an end-of-year test or whatever, of course, teachers have to keep in mind what that test involves. Is there any other questions? Are there any? Bill?
A lot of reading texts and course books are designed to input vocabulary, lexics usually. And I'm just wondering what you feel about the kind of, you know, find a synonym for that kind of stuff, which is classic in course books.
It's a really good question, thank you. And I wish I had remembered to say, it was in my head to say it, that sort of schematic plan I gave you is not exhaustive. You know, there are bits that are added to it, and quite often the vocabulary thing, find a synonym, is one of those very common activities. I think it might be useful sometimes, but I do have a bit of an issue with it, because we sometimes teach synonyms as if they're words that mean the same, and they're not. really. They're words that are pretty similar, but probably not always interchangeable. And you actually need to think, well, hold on, you know, the synonym, would it actually fit back into that context? And I think when it's useful is when teachers start thinking and learners start thinking about, well, why then did the author choose that one over that one? This synonym would work, and you could brainstorm what other synonyms would go there. But given that the choice of vocabulary is probably context dependent, what's been said before, the style of the text and all of those things, I think we need to also, whenever we do anything with synonyms, think about how they're different as well as how they're similar, particularly at higher levels. How are they different to how they're similar? Thank you for the question.
Could you maybe suggest some kind of vocab exercise that would fit with this reading activity?
Off the top of my head, yes. One of the things I do like doing with students is giving them synonyms and then getting them to compare, you know, the differences between them, and always the difference between them. But there's a lot of research which shows that vocabulary choices and actually a lot of grammar choices are context dependent. And one of the things I would say about a lot of material we get given in course books and that is that you have the context in the text, but it's not always very well exploited. So you get a piece of grammar, for example, presented in a reading text, but actually it's just a segue from the reading into a grammar analysis. And what would be really useful is to look at why that grammar choice was made in that text, what came before it and what came after it. So I think anything that gets that actually exploits the text, I think is really good. Are we done? No.
Would you agree that for activities like this, your students need quite a good mastery of English?
Yeah, thank you very much for...
Does this also work for A1, A2 level texts for the younger learners?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I'm well aware that the things I suggested to you today are for probably, I don't know, B1, B2 upwards. But I think there are still things we can do for lower level students.
Do you have a suggestion?
Yes. There's one that I use quite a lot with my students, actually, at all levels, but it does work well. As long as the students have progressed from reading individual words to clusters of words, sentences, I just read to them, and they follow it. And then I sometimes sort of say, what's the next word? But the idea of doing it is that I read faster than them, and so they have to follow it through, and I'm pushing them to read fluently, quicker. And the reason for that is that research evidence shows that fluency in reading actually correlates with comprehension. So quicker, fluent readers understand more of text, so we need to help learners develop fluency. And you can do that at any level. And the other thing I like doing with very sort of low-level learners is to get them to tell me a story in class, you know, just orally. And then we build it up on the board and read the text that they themselves have created, because I think you've got to teach low-level learners to read from text that they already understand, really. If you think about reading in your L1, you know the story that you're reading, you know, when you're a little, 3, 4 years old. You know the stories that you get given almost off by heart, and you learn to read from those. I wouldn't start teaching an L2 learner with a text they've never seen. You know, they need to know the story, I think.
I was going to suggest for the younger learners a pictorial response.
That's a great a great idea. Yes, we can get students to draw texts, pick a key moment in the text which they choose to represent in some way. Great. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for coming.